So, Lone Rider here, and something that came to my attention recently was that YouTube was going to be demonetizing people who haven't broken the rules just because certain people are bothered by what they're saying or doing. And I guess the point I wanted to make is that having a subjective standard, like somebody's bothered by this, it kind of defeats the whole point of having rules and standards, right? The whole point of having rules and standards is so people can know what they're allowed to do on a particular platform and don't do it in the first place. If you change the rules after the fact, make them retroactive, have vague and cockamamie rules that nobody can really wrap their head around, or if you have just a subjective standard that, like, well, somebody's feelings are hurt by this, somebody's offended. Okay, that means absolutely nothing. All sorts of people are offended by all sorts of things. If that's the case, then essentially you'd have to shut down the internet, right? I mean, everybody would be bad. And it annoys me that this is something that hasn't caused maybe a little more outrage by people, that people should be looking at this, whether they agree with the folks who are getting demonetized or not. Admittedly, a lot of them are to the political right or center, not to the political left. So, if you're somebody who doesn't agree with these people, you might say, well, why not kick them off? Why not demonetize them? Who cares? The short answer to that is that, basic fairness doesn't have a political allegiance. If it's the wrong thing to do, it's the wrong thing to do, whether you agree with the person it's being done to or not. And the second thing, of course, is a more practical and pragmatic concern, which is that if it can be done to somebody else of a differing view, it can be done to you too sooner or later, right? The old saying, well, they came for these people and I didn't stand up for them because what did I care? And then they came for these people and I didn't stand up for them. And then they came for me and I was like, help! And there was nobody to help me because, that's sort of the situation here. If a precedent is established that something is tolerated or can be done, or people are going to sit still for it to one person or one group of people, it could just as easily be done to somebody else. And the whole thing is distasteful, right? I'm just old enough that when I was growing up, we had the first rumblings of this. I remember, in fact, a USA Today editorial from the 1990s when I was in high school. And I remember specifically because it was so against what I always thought and what I was taught growing up, which is that, you disagree with somebody, you don't attack their ability to say what they're saying. You simply try to refute their arguments. If you can't, you can't. Some people are just going to disagree about things. But the point is, the prevailing view when I was growing up, and I caught the tail end of this, like I said, as the change was starting to slowly take place, but the prevailing view was still largely, I disagree with what you're saying, but I support your right to say it. Right? Now it's, I disagree with what you're saying and you should be demonetized, banned, and made to go sit in the corner wearing a dunce cap. And they've actually talked, in some cases, about criminal penalties for people who say things that bother other people. Well, I guess the freedom of speech no longer exists in that case, right? And the irony is people always start with something that they think everybody will support getting rid of, like hate speech or extremism. And these things sound really bad, right? And who's in favor of hate? Who's in favor of extremism? Well, in the way these people mean it, nobody is, right? But think about these. These are terms that actually are very nebulous, right? A person can be an extremist in the interest of justice. They can have an extreme devotion to truth or personal freedom or any other thing that's actually a virtue, that's a value rather than a negative. So extremism, generally speaking, I mean, it's about degree. It's content neutral. You can have extremism that's for the good and for the bad. And of course, hate speech, most of us, when we hear the word initially, we're thinking, something awful like a swastika or something. But generally speaking, what usually happens sooner or later is they end up just using that to apply to anything that they don't like, right? So somebody will start off using the word hate speech and mean a very particular, very narrow focused thing that most people are going to agree is awful. But instead, what usually ends up happening is that definition gets broader and broader and broader. And next thing you know, even people who are against hate speech are being accused of hate speech because it's not about hate speech anymore. It's about having a label to tar and feather your political adversaries or somebody who simply disagrees with you about anything. And this isn't how it should be going, right? I'd go back to that column in the USA Today newspaper I remember reading when I was in high school. This is a long time ago. It was like 20 years ago. And it stuck in my craw 20 years later, and I'm just remembering verbatim. I mean, I didn't actually go and dig it out of the file cabinet and read it. I think I may have saved some of the articles from that time period I saved. I don't know if I saved this one, but off the top of my head, I can recall it. The title was "Is Our Freedom of Speech Too Free?" And it talked about the concept of toxic speech that was making politics meaner and nastier and so on and so forth. And the thing is, the most toxic speech of all, if you think about it, is that which condemns the right of people to say what they're going to say. So you want to talk about toxic speech, how about that USA Today article that was actually arguing for censorship as if it was a good thing, with no like understanding of how that would sound to most people at the time. The thing is, in the mid-1990s, that was still a fringe view. It was still something that most people might disagree with something or be against something, but they're not going to argue that it should be censored, and they're not going to openly argue for censorship in a major newspaper. That's just not... I think when most people read that editorial in the 1990s in the USA Today calling for censorship, that they probably had the same reaction I did, that, well, what these people are talking about, people saying, is definitely bad. The idea of censorship is worse, and how the hell did this get published in a major newspaper? Like, what's wrong with these people? Well, fast forward 20 years, and we've woken up in a Kafkaesque world where there's been a metamorphosis. And what used to be a weird fringe idea that most people would be against, namely censorship, is now something that a lot of people are getting behind. Largely because I think they can use it to their political advantage. Again, the problem with this, of course, is that if you set the precedent that you can censor certain views, well, your views may be next, depending on, who happens to be in power at the time. You don't want to set that precedent at all. It's just wrong. Now, of course, we're talking about a internet platform in the virtual world here, not the real world. So, the question of, is it censorship? I think we can definitely call it soft censorship, maybe with a lowercase c. It's an attempt to suppress certain views. It's an attempt to get people to stop saying or talking about things. It's not censorship strictly speaking with a capital C, because that, of course, has to be government action. However, consider the reason why censorship traditionally is government action. Because in the real world, not in the virtual world in your computer, but in the real world out here, where we all walk around and breathe and ride our bikes and do whatever, the government is the only entity that has the ability to actually try and silence you. I mean, a private citizen can try to through intimidation or threats of violence, but they're committing a crime if they do that. The government, because it has a legal monopoly on the use of force, if it can somehow manage to sidestep the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights, they're good to go as far as censoring goes. And that's why it's traditionally been censorship has to be government action to be considered censorship, because in the real world, the government's the only entity that has a legal monopoly on the use of force and can actually try and censor you. Here's the thing, though. When in the real world, your first go-to politically isn't a letter to the editor of the newspaper or a public meeting or talking to somebody over the counter at the diner, but instead online discussion and discourse and things like that, well then in the real world, your first go-to is actually the virtual world. And in the virtual world, these entities and companies that run these internet platforms are the government. They have the power to do things and make decisions that in the virtual world are even more powerful than the government's power in the real world. Because the government might be able to coerce you or initiate force against you legally, but it can't flat out like erase you from existence. Well, I mean, I guess if it, if somebody were to come and like, take you away to jail or something. But in the virtual world, these people can deplatform you, ban you, cancel your website or your YouTube channel or whatever, which means that they have the power to literally snap their fingers and you're erased from your existence within the virtual world anyway. That's a hell of a lot more power than the ability to merely exercise some legal coercion, which is what the government has in the real world. It may actually be incorrect for me to have said that in the virtual world, these people are like the government. Actually, since they're the people who run the virtual world, not just its, administrative processes, but the world itself, online, these people aren't like the government. They're actually more like a god, right? In that sense. They can, boom, snap your fingers and you no longer exist. So I do think that maybe we should consider looking at what constitutes censorship in the 21st century. Obviously, government action to suppress views is still censorship. But what I'm saying is maybe we should broaden the definition when under certain circumstances, the actions of private parties rise to the same level of danger and menace and negative effects of actual censorship in the real world, right? And one of those circumstances is when it takes place in the virtual world, that virtual censorship with a small c, well, that's as bad as actual censorship by the government in the virtual world. Because in the virtual world, these people have all the power, just like in the real world, the government has a legal monopoly on the use of force. And of course, the two things are intersected because, again, in the real world, the first go-to for many people is the virtual world. So, it's not like this is something, well, it's just contained to the internet. No, it has effects in the real world as well. It's people in the real world who are using the internet. Hello. So.